I'm curious for both your thoughts on what we have here in Luther Burrell, because this could potentially become an inquiry akin to what we saw in cricket, in rugby. Luther Burrell has played for England. He's 32 years of age. He'd be a very well-known player, and he's been interviewed exclusively here by Nick Simon in the Mail on Sunday about racism in the dressing room. And the initial part of the interview is how Nick Simon had a phone call with Luther Burrell about racism in rugby more generally a while back, and his answer was, it's rife. And then they went for an off-the-record dinner a few months later, and Luther Burrell talked about what he had experienced and has now decided to go public with it. And he talks about how, I've been nervous doing this. They met in a coffee shop. I didn't sleep much last night. This is a scary subject to broach. I don't know how it will be received. And he talked about his dad, wondering, are you going to do it, not do it? And he said, I'm going to do it. He stresses he's not going to name names. He says, this isn't a witch hunt. I don't want people to feel sorry for me. A lot of what's said isn't even malicious, but it's become normal and it needs to be addressed. And he talked about, in part, what helped him make up his mind up about going public was the thought of his mixed-race children being on the receiving end of what he's received. So, for instance, Burrell's been in the professional game since '06. He said, things get said in jest without any thought every week, every fortnight. Comments about bananas when you're making a smoothie in the morning. Comments about fried chicken when you're out for dinner. I've heard things you wouldn't expect to hear 20 years ago. We had a hot day at training and I told one of the lads to put on their Factor 50. Someone came back and said, you don't need it, Luth. Put your carrot oil on. Then another lad jumps in and says, no, he'll need it for where his shackles were as a slave. Excuse my language, but where the F does that come from? Some people shake their heads, others laugh along with it. People greet you as, what's up my N? It's not meant in a bad way, but when is it going to change? It's a very, very raw subject. Over the past few years, it has happened a lot. That's the environment. It's normalised because it's normalised because I allowed it to become normalised. I'd laugh it off. I've been a coward by not speaking up. Over the years, I've become thicker skinned. And he said he's at an age now at 32 where he feels he can speak up. He says if you're 20 and there's a hierarchy, you're just told, be quiet. And so it's hard for a younger player to speak up. He says, after a few beers, I have said to fellow teammates, mate, you've got to stop saying that. But it never changed anything. You just get, we love you really, mate, back. If I was 10 years younger, no way would I be sat here doing this. You want to fit in. He says, I'm sure there are clubs that don't have a problem, but rugby clubs don't have HR departments like the real world.
One of the lines he says, rugby's a high testosterone environment with a lot of big personalities. I can't believe those comments. I mean, I can't credit that adult people would use those comments. Do you know what I mean? It's just beyond my comprehension. And all you can, now we don't know whether they're fellow club players, fellow schools players, fellow internationals, but either way, I just can't believe that anybody thinks like that. And it's just absolutely shocking. We were just talking about and saying that, maybe you will have a situation like cricket in England where it might spark an investigation, or certainly he says he won't name names. There are some really interesting things. He it smacks of that, entitled, that entitled obnoxiousness that just comes from people who are, I just see themselves as superior to everybody else. And he says rugby definitely has a class issue, and he talks about Ellis Genge. He makes that point. He says about Genge getting messages calling him a N-word, would Mario Itoje, and that always has been like Mario. It's always been pointed out Mario Itoje comes from that private school background, But whatever or wherever people come from, it's just shocking. He talks about growing up in a council estate in Huddersfield. His parents worked exceptionally hard and I wasn't given any freebies. Do football changing rooms have this type of stuff being around? No, because it's far more diverse. I actually disagree with that. I suspect football... I suspect there is some element of it, and we see this racism in British football. So we know there is an element of it, but is there more a class element to this, and is racism more pronounced for that reason, perhaps, in English rugby? But I find it shocking, really shocking.
He does talk about class as well. He said you see the rugby culture and you see the cricket culture. They're a very similar class. Guys from these feeder schools, at the stuff that came out from cricket recently didn't surprise me, he says.
Yeah, it's that privileged, entitled thing of, you know, we're going to always follow this course in life because we have, you know, we have private educations. You know, this will take us certain places in our lives, and so we're for some reason we can make comments, you know, and judge other people. I think I really think what's interesting is I don't know whether you noticed this towards the end of this interview, and he says, "I'll tell you what's funny. All the black people I spoke to about this, in other words, about talking out about this, said, do it." The white people were all supportive, but they said things like, "Oh, do you not want to get your contract sorted first?" Yeah. I think that's very interesting.
I think this blows up massively now. If there was a Westminster committee looking into what happened in cricket, I don't see how they can sit in their hands with this.
Yeah, I think, you know, he refers to the rugby culture, and you see the cricket culture. They're very similar class guys from those feeder schools. The stuff that came out of cricket recently didn't surprise me. I think, you know, it's a further example of what you get when you have the dangers of a small, sort of culturally narrow caste involved in something. I think what he's meaning about the football environment is that it is a much more diverse, but probably at an institutional level, I'm sure you know you still have so few black people in positions of authority and management. But here, like, it smacks of that sort of, you know, Boris Johnson talking about, you know, watermelon smiles and, you know, pickaninnies, like that sort of, like, you know, post-imperial lowbrow, you know, public school humour that is a way of underlining that sense of cultural superiority that does seem to come through. Like, it's interesting. It is an interesting piece because you do read it and you're shocked, and then they go on to talk about, like, does the class element explain it, or is it the fact that maybe English rugby is still large majority sort of a white privileged sport? I mean, I don't know, but back to your point, Joe, like, once you start, and the thing with the cricket story was, once you start picking away at what's going on here, it's very hard for this to end up to be a root and branch study of what is going on, because if this is going on and there's a guy who's been, I mean, he's finished now, he seems to be finished now in English club rugby and maybe looking to play in Japan, and obviously feels ready to come out and talk about it. There's clearly loads of other players who have just said, "Oh, I'm not dealing with it," and that line about get your contract sorted first and keep your head down, make your living, like, that's been the sort of the fuel for, you know, people putting up with crap in all sorts of, you know, areas, be it, you know, gender, race, or whatever, down through the years. So if this is something that, you know, once sponsors start getting involved in what's going on here, this could end up, you know, gathering momentum.
Huge momentum. And it's, you know, it's interesting. The only, as you said, Cliona, you wonder what's the perspective of those who are doing it. The only glimpse we get of that is when he says, and this is very similar to the cricket conversation which happened, is when he mentions after a few beers he has said to teammates, "Mate, you've got to stop saying that." Their response is, "Oh, we love you really, mate." So there's this sense almost of actually, not only is it just banter, it's almost even a step further of brotherhood, that I can say this to you.
Yeah, because we're such good mates. That shows how
close we are.
Yeah.
That seems to be the perception that he's on the receiving end of, I think.
Yeah, and his own openness and his own, you know, integration is really reflected, because he says at the end of it, he says, "I want to look back," and he wants to talk because he said, my son or my daughter might end up in want to be professional rugby players, you know. And it's very interesting. Maggie Alfonsi has said in England that she intends running for the head of the RFU over there towards 2025, which is really interesting. A black woman. How interesting would that be?
Well, I put his name into Google News this morning when I first read this to see what the uptake was, and straight away the Daily Telegraph on their website had Luther Burrell, "I've had the N-word used to me." This thing will be huge, and this will be dominating in 24 hours time. So
and it is that thing that you talk about, that dressing room culture, where it's sort of the people, you know, dishing it out think, "Well, I'll tell you how you should feel about this.
Sure,
it's just banter, and you shouldn't be offended by this," and you know that won't stand up for long.